Hello guys, and welcome to my channel. The theme for this video is the guru-shishya relationship, or the relationship between a teacher of yoga or meditation and their students. I've had this topic requested by a lot of people, and this is probably going to be one of my longest videos, so please try to remain for the entire video, because I think that some of the stuff I'm going to touch upon today is vital to actually getting somewhere with your sadhana and understanding the yogic and the dharmic systems as they're supposed to be understood. In this video, I'll both explain the function, the direct function of the teacher, in addition to answering some questions from students and questions from people who follow me on Instagram. And I'll also explain some parts of the esoteric or occult components of the guru-shishya relationship. Guru-shishya meaning teacher and student, simply. I will explain why I think a teacher is vital. I'll also explain how to find and test a teacher and find the right teacher for you. And I'll also explain what I find to be characteristics of good versus bad teachers. In addition, I'll also explain what a teacher is and what a teacher isn't in a yogi context. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please do so. That'd be really nice. I'd appreciate that. Before I start, I want to clarify from which position I'm talking in this video. In this video, I'm talking from my experience as being a yoga teacher, and the epistemology I'm drawing upon in this video is both my direct experience as a teacher and a student of my teachers, and the wisdom and knowledge from the yogic and the Buddhistic literature. All right. So what is a yoga teacher? First and foremost, I define a teacher of yoga or meditation by two things, and now I'm talking on the practical, technical plane. A teacher is a link to tradition. So a teacher is a vehicle by which you gain access to a tradition that exists above the horizontal or physical plane. That's the most important function of your teacher, is to be a vehicle or a link whereby you can connect to tradition and draw upon the power and the knowledge of the tradition that you practice within. That's the most important function of a teacher that I'm going to touch upon throughout this entire video. The second function of a teacher, and now I'm talking on the horizontal or the material plane, is to be somebody who both has technical and theoretical competency and expertise within the tradition that he is embodying or she is embodying. By theoretical competency and expertise, I mean somebody who is able to explain the theoretical framework of a system, whether that system be yoga or Buddhism or Tai Chi or any system for that matter, and somebody who has the technical competency that you need in order to convey and teach the techniques and the sadhana of a system to somebody else. Both these things are very, very important. In the modern yogic community, a lot of people talk about teaching through embodiment, which means that you can't convey theoretically, but you teach by embodying and by, I don't know what is meant by that term. I think theoretical understanding, a firm theoretical understanding of the system that you're teaching is vital. And I'm going to touch upon that more throughout this video as well. It's important because you need to explain the dynamics of the system to your students. It's very, very important that before a student undertakes a sadhana or a practice, that they understand the theoretical worldview that underlies the practice that they're doing. This is very important. A lot of people are trying to psychologize and scientize the yogic and the Buddhist systems. So by that I mean people try to make it conform to the scientific model or our modern Western conception of human psychology. And in doing so, they're neglecting the paradigm itself. So they're reducing Buddhism or yoga to be something that is only related to how you influence your mood through neuropsychology, but it's not. It's really important that a teacher is able to explain. So say, for example, that you're teaching yoga, classical yoga, it's important that you're able to explain the yogic system in its own terms. So it's very cool if you can explain yoga and convey yoga through using correlates from psychology or neuropsychology. That's beautiful and that's very useful in many cases. But it's also really important that you're able to explain the system traditionally, that you're able to explain the system of the chakras, the vikalpas, the the vrittis, the kleshats, etc., etc. These things need to be known in order for you to teach, and in order for you as a teacher to be linked to tradition and thus able to transmit that tradition onto your students. I'm going to touch upon that point a little bit later in the video as well. So the two main functions of a teacher is to function as a vehicle and a gateway into tradition, which is perennial, of course, and to be somebody who has a technical and theoretical competency to the extent that they're able to convey both technique and theory to their students. So the first question I'm going to touch upon is by Anna, a very good friend and a fellow yogini. What makes teachers good or bad? Now, I'm not a big fan of using terminology as good and bad when it comes to teaching sadhana or dharma, but I'm using the term skillful or skilled. Skilled here being a direct translation of the Sanskrit upaya, somebody who is skillful in their means, skillful in their actions. Upaya, important word, skillful. The first point that I think is very important to distinguish a good and competent teacher is that they're able to have a meta-systematic approach. Meta meaning above in Greek, and systematic meaning employing systems of thought or systems of practice. By meta-systematic, I mean that the teacher is able to look above the system, to look at the system that they're teaching from above. This requires that they have attained the meditative states inherent in the system. You cannot explain samadhi or teach yoga without having been in the state of yoga, yoga and samadhi being synonyms. It's vital that you have direct experience with what you're teaching. If you do not have direct experience in what you're teaching, you will be completely reliant on the system, which means that you're not able to communicate elastically and responsively to your students. You are dependent on using the system itself. The system itself is important, but having a meta-systematic approach means that you're able to communicate to the student in question exactly what that student needs to hear instead of being reliant on the system. A lot of teachers are overtly reliant on the system because they haven't experienced the attainments, or they haven't actually done the work that that system traditionally includes. And that makes them totally dependent on the words and the terminology of the system in order to convey something. So the first distinguishing characteristic that I find in competent teachers is that they're able to speak in a manner that is understandable and intelligible to their students. They're able to change their way of teaching. They're able to change the words, the phrases, and their terminology according to the position and the need of that particular student. First distinguishing characteristic there. The second one is that I think any good teacher has to have a teacher him or herself. I do not believe that you're fit or capable of teaching other people if you have not been a student of somebody else or currently is a student of somebody else. Me, for example, I have students and I have teachers above me again. I think that's really, really important to keep the teacher's ego in check. And also to help you as a teacher, because having students can be overwhelming and you need somebody above you in the spiritual hierarchy that you can turn to if you have any questions or if you're experiencing being overwhelmed, for example, by what you're doing. It's extremely important that the traditional chain of transmission is kept intact. You cannot teach other people if you do not know what it means to be a student. And this chain of transmission needs to be kept open at all times. You're never done learning. You always need to keep those lines of communication open, meaning that you always need a teacher above you if you have students below you. Also note that here I'm not talking about the Western style bastardized 200 RIT kind of acrobatics. I'm talking about the classical guru-shishya yogic Buddhistic relationship between teacher and students, which is based on the idea that the hierarchical links on the material or the horizontal plane connects to a spiritual hierarchy, which is the fundament or the essence, if you will, of the system, which I'm going to touch upon later when I talk about the esoteric dimensions of the student-teacher relationship. Anyways, a teacher, a good teacher, moreover, is somebody who is linked to capital T tradition. Somebody who has a tradition to draw from, somebody who has the power and the grace of an ancient spiritual tradition behind them. Examples of this are the lineages of classical yoga and the lineages of Buddhism. Because having that traditional lineage behind you means that you're able to draw upon the power, the grace, and the wisdom of more than 1,000 years of teacher-student relationships that is behind you again. That imbues the entire relationship between a teacher and their students with a certain power and a certain grace that comes from the spiritual plane and that passes through that teacher into the student, which imbues and lubricates their practice and your function as a teacher with the grace that is inherent in that lineage. So the lineages, being traditional, being something that is repeated across time and space, they have tremendous power. The lineages in the Buddhist way of thinking about them go back to the historical Buddha himself, and he again is linked to the spiritual hierarchy of the Buddhas, which means that every human part of that chain of transmission becomes a vehicle for the force and the grace of that lineage to manifest on the horizontal plane, thereby creating this meeting point between the spiritual or the vertical plane and the horizontal plane. That happens through initiation that follows the traditional hierarchy of teaching. So this is very, very important. A teacher, thus, is somebody who is firmly linked and established to a spiritual tradition. By tradition, I mean something that is in different forms, of course, depending on time and place, repeated over time. Something that is not invented 2 days ago in Los Angeles, but something that has been kept in a certain way and in a certain state for many, many generations. Also, keeping something for many, many generations, keeping a teaching intact across time and space, also makes that teaching extremely powerful, and we thus become vehicles for that teaching and the power of that teaching or the power of that tradition to manifest on the physical plane. Being connected to tradition is of paramount importance as a student and as a teacher, because it gives the practice a whole other level of power and grace. Two terms I'll explain a little bit more in detail later. Then again, as I've said earlier, a teacher who is linked to tradition is also linked to the direct experience. There is something that happens when you connect to a teacher who is connected to a tradition, and that is that certain kinds of blessings starts to occur for you in your sadhana, and this blessing takes the form of grace. Grace meaning something that you do not work for yourself, something that descends upon you through the spiritual hierarchy, which is dependent on that hierarchy being connected to tradition or lineage. If you do not know what I mean by the term tradition, check out my Instagram posts about that, or read Guinon or Evola. A good teacher, moreover, and this point is super, super important, especially on the day-to-day plane, the material plane, is that a good teacher of sadhana, a good teacher of dharma, is somebody who understands the limitations and the scope of their role. A spiritual teacher is not your parent, it's not your partner, it's not your friend, nor your life coach. That doesn't mean that your teacher cannot be your friend outside of the teaching community or the teaching situation. But when a spiritual teacher or a yoga teacher, a guru, functions in their role as a guru, they are firmly established in that role. Teachers are not responsible for motivating their students to do anything. A teacher is responsible for, as I said earlier, to convey technique and theory and function as a vehicle to tradition. But a teacher is not responsible for encouraging somebody to do practice that needs to come from the student, him or herself. That cannot come from the teacher. A teacher cannot be a cheerleader that encourages or coerces somebody to do a certain practice. That needs to come from the student. It's not the teacher's job to be a motivator. It's really, really important that you do not take that role as a teacher, because then you create a very unhealthy codependency with your students. If you motivate your students to do a practice, and if you function as a parent, then you will only create dependency going from the student to you. The student will be dependent on your acknowledgement of their sadhana in order to function, and that creates a very unhealthy constellation that is not a part of tradition, that is not a part of yoga or dharma. When you function as a teacher, you function as a teacher, meaning that you function as a transmitter of tradition through theory and practice. Very, very important. That when I function as a teacher to my students, when I function as a teacher, not as a friend, because I'm very, very close with a lot of my students, but when I function as a teacher, I do not give them relationship advice. I do not give them life advice. I don't talk about what they should and should not do. I say that this is what my experience is, and this is what tradition says. I do not say that you should or should not do anything. That's not your job as a teacher. So hands off is a very good approach when it comes to how you should place yourself in constellation to your students. I'm very mindful of not taking that role or responsibility, because a lot of us, when we first come into spirituality, we seek an acknowledgement from somebody else that we need to learn to give ourselves. So seeking that kind of positive reaffirmation that you're good enough from your teacher, that only creates dependency when you should be able to give that reassurance to yourself. So it's very important, and that can be very hard as a teacher, to not go too deeply or meddle too deeply into people's lives. That can be hard because compassion is a natural thing that blossoms within you when you practice sadhana. But it's really important not to meddle too much in your students' affairs or your students' lives, especially not when you're in the role of a teacher. So the bad teacher would be the opposite of what I just said. A bad teacher would be somebody who teaches a sadhana or a dharma or a teaching that they do not understand themselves. A lot of the practices of yoga, or a lot of the advanced stuff that we do in certain circumstances, advanced meditations, I teach advanced techniques to my advanced students. Those can be very, very unsettling if you do not have the proper preparation for them. And being able to recognize that somebody is ready for a certain tantra or a certain sadhana only comes from having direct experience with that practice. So never, ever teach anything, whether that be theory or practice, that you do not firmly understand or have personal direct experience with yourself, because you can fuck people up quite badly. And that comes from somebody being me, who in my younger years did advanced meditation practices because I thought, like, hell, like, let's get on with it. And I was completely mentally unstabilized for, well, a good year from doing advanced practices, because some of the advanced practices, their very purpose is to deconstruct your entire sense of self or identity. And doing that when you're not ready for it, or not willing to actually accept the responsibility that those experiences entail, can be extremely damaging. So that's why it's super, super important, and a characteristic of good teacher, that they do not speak, they do not explain, they do not teach what they do not firmly understand themselves. And how to see if somebody firmly understands something, as I said earlier, look at how they convey it. Are they dependent upon using words or a system or a model, or are they able to explain it in a way that you understand? Because if they're able to be that responsive to your needs, then they actually have the direct experience. And I think this is a telling characteristic of whether somebody has that or not, that they're able to explain something in a way that resonates with your needs as a student. That is not to say that you should expect everything to be understandable or intelligible at first, but at a certain point, I think a lot of us can actually recognize if people have experience with what they're teaching or talking about. I think it's visible in how they resonate with that thing. Moreover, a bad teacher, as opposed to a good teacher, is somebody who meddles in your life and tells you what not or what to do. If somebody says that you should break up with somebody or get together with that person or sleep with that person, as is very common in Western Neo-Tantra, that's a toxic, dangerous teacher that is not fit to teach anything. A good teacher, meddles as little in your life as possible and is only a reflective presence that allows you to attain the acknowledgement and experiences yourself. There's a lot of cases of teachers abusing students, especially in Western Tantra, which is, of course, not Tantra at all, not even close, but a teacher who tries to control you at an early stage. There are, of course, certain elements of a practice where a teacher can say you should really consider stop doing this kind of behavior, or simply explaining to you what the consequences of your behavior is. But if you look at a lot of, I'll use an example, the New Tantra is a group that teaches Tantra in the West. And one of the earliest things that that group do is that they get you to go 21 days without ejaculating as a man, I think it is. And then progressively they have levels, of course. And for each level, you're asked to challenge yourself, which in this system always means doing something sexually that you're not really comfortable with doing. And of course, the way this is branded and sold is that it helps you, open up your ego and personality and stuff, because you're challenging yourself in your own comfort zones and stuff. That's not what this is doing. This is creating a willingness to obey orders that you do not feel like obeying. This creates a control, because it goes so deeply into a fundamental level of your being like the sexual dimension, that once you have outsourced that control to somebody else's expertise or thoughts about what you should not do, then they kind of have you on the hook already. So be very, very careful with that kind of behavior. A teacher saying that you need to do something that you're uncomfortable with doing. If a teacher requires you to do something that you don't want to do in order for you to receive a teaching, that person is most likely some kind of narcissist or predator and not a teacher at all. Again, here, I think the vital point here is that a teacher will never ask you to do anything. A teacher is there, and once you're ready to do a certain practice or receive a certain teaching, then you approach the teacher and ask for guidance or ask for teaching. But a real teacher never seeks out students and says that I will become your teacher. That, I think, is a sign of a need to be in a position of authority or superiority to somebody else. And that's a characteristic of narcissism or pretty severe insecurity, not somebody who is in line or in contact with dharma or tradition. Next point, then, is why is a teacher important, and why is the teacher important? At a practical stage, when you do, let's say, meditation, you will experience difficulties. You will experience what we call the kleshas, the hindrances to meditation. And meditation is not simply sitting with your eyes closed, feeling sorry for yourself or observing your thoughts. That's a prerequisite. It's the preliminary training, sati. Meditation is a very, very deep, grasping, fundamentally changing, continually varying experience. And if you want to get into meditation properly, if you want to get into advanced real meditation, you need somebody you can play ball with continuously. Somebody who can guide you a little bit, somebody who can relate to your experiences, which is a vital point of the teacher-student relationship, and somebody who's able to continually give you advice and help you adjust your practice. This is super, super important. When I teach meditation to people, I usually have weekly classes with those people so that I once a week can help them adjust their practice. So this is the frequency that I like to have when it comes to teaching meditation, just because meditation both has a tendency to really plunge into the depths of your personality and bring a lot of stuff up to the surface that you might need somebody to talk to you about. And also because meditation is a process that is a little bit different for each individual, and you just thus need somebody who can help you adjust and make the important adjustments to the practice as you go along with it. So that's an important part of the teacher-student relationship, that you need to continuously adapt and check your progress and your sadhana with somebody who has experienced the experiences themselves. So first point of the importance of the teacher. So the next point, which is really important, is that a teacher helps you keep your ego in check. A teacher can tell you whether you've experienced, you know, Nirodha Samapatti, or whether you've just been a little bit blissed out from meditation. It's common to have very powerful experiences if you're under the tutelage of a good teacher. It's common, if you practice Hatha Yoga correctly, traditionally, that you experience Kundalini awakenings pretty early on, depending on how much you practice, of course. And it's common in meditative paths to experience some very mind-altering, consciousness-expanding stuff pretty early. And it's, you know, easy to assume that you've attained some state of enlightenment. And it's very important to have a teacher that can also help you, you know, get your feet back down on the ground and help you adjust your ego a little bit along the way. Which is also why it's super important for the teacher, him or herself, to have a teacher above them again. Because it helps bring personality out of the equation a little bit. A teacher, moreover, is somebody who exemplifies the Dharma. A teacher teaching something needs to be an embodiment or a manifestation of what they're teaching. If you're teaching meditation and you're an aggressive, dishonest asshole, you haven't experienced meditation, because meditation is something that by necessity changes your personality, makes you more present, more, you know, more happy, more honest, more in tune. So a teacher is somebody who exemplifies the behavior and the discipline of somebody who's practicing the Dharma, which is super, super important. A teacher needs to have adamant discipline and a fair theoretical understanding of the system. So super, super important. Often overlooked, I think, that a teacher needs to be an exemplification or an illustration of what they're teaching. They need to embody it, of course. They can't only practice ahimsa and satya within the yoga room. They need to be embodiments of that in their lives in general. Of course, like, nobody's perfect, and I'm not saying that everybody who teaches meditation or yoga needs to be bodhisattvas or fully enlightened beings. But it's important to continuously strive to be a good example for your students, because it's a great responsibility to have people learning from you. Moreover, a skillful upaya teacher is somebody who challenges the student's paradigms, somebody who is able to help the student step out of their self-narrative and their world narrative a little bit, and help them see things a little bit differently. And this touches upon the point I mentioned earlier, that there are a lot of teachers who are reducing the spiritual systems to become mere neurobiological changes in you. So meditation is only effective because it ups your serotonin production or something, which it does. By all means, like, beautiful things happen to the body and the brain if you practice meditation. But it's important also as a teacher to challenge the students' paradigms a little bit and help them see things a little bit differently. And here comes the importance of being able to transmit the system and create that meeting point between the students' worldview and your worldview as a teacher. When real teaching takes place, real initiation, real transmission, the student steps out of their worldview, of their personal universe. The teacher, on his side, steps out of his personal universe, because he can't expect the student to understand his universe or his experiences, or the student can either expect the teacher to understand where they're coming from. And they are stepping into each other's universes and creating this shared space that makes both the universe of the teacher and the universe of the student a little bit more nuanced, brighter, bigger, and more expansive. That's the meaning of the Sanskrit word sutra, which means thread. That's when the thread of transmission or initiation is being connected between teacher and student, and that's where transmission of tradition takes place. When both the teacher and the student together step out of their universes and meet each other in a common shared space. As a teacher as well, it's extremely important to understand that every student you have represent another facet, another perspective to the universe, and is thus something that is extremely meaningful for you. every time you have a student, that student is a portal to another way of looking at the world and the universe. So every student should broaden your understanding of the Dharma and broaden your understanding of the human being and the universe that we inhabit. Because every student and every human being on the planet is a little bit of a different perspective on reality and has their own experiences and understandings. So every student you have as a teacher is an enrichment of your understanding of the world. And every student you teach makes your skill as a teacher greater and greater and greater. Because every time you get a new student, you need to explain things a little bit differently. And that makes you more and more competent as a teacher, which is important to keep in mind and to observe that humility that should bring about in yourself as a teacher. Another thing when it comes to the importance of the teacher, why a teacher is important, is that a good teacher is always relational. A good teacher is somebody who can relate to the experiences you're having. And when something is relational, when something is shared between more people, it becomes more powerful and it becomes more of a living presence than if it's not. So fair, you can probably learn some kind of yoga or meditation from just reading books, but having an embodied living teacher makes the practice something you can relate to at a human-to-human level, which is a very important part of the student-teacher relationship as well. I think that self-realization or the development of yourself never takes place in isolation. It always takes place in your relation to the world and other people. And I think that it's in your relation to the world that you can really see if somebody has made progress spiritually, because any real attainment on the spiritual plane will always manifest itself on the horizontal plane. We talk in Buddhism about wisdom and compassion, prajna and karuna, being two wings of a bird. The wisdom is the vertical attainments. So the wisdom is you being able to pierce through reality with your mind and seeing, the self, tadrashtu svarupe vashtaram. But compassion is that attainment being manifested on the physical plane. So that's really, really important to keep in mind that if you want to look at somebody and observe and ascertain whether they've actually made some spiritual progress, I think one of the best ways to actually look at that is to see if there's been any changes in how they relate to the world, both how they relate to wider society, but also how they relate to the people around them. That's called a spouse test in meditation, that when your partner or your spouse says that you've changed, then you've made real spiritual progress. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the esoteric components of the student-teacher relationship. So keep yourself a little bit in check right now, because this is probably going to be a little bit weird, because now I'm talking on a purely spiritual plane, a purely esoteric plane. Now, of course, I'm not teaching full esoteric doctrines, because I never do that on a YouTube video, but I'm going to try to talk a little bit, try to put some seeds in your mind here when it comes to the esoteric understanding of the student-teacher relationship. Esoteric meaning inner components, spiritual components. In the doctrine of Mahayana Buddhism, the great vehicle Buddhism, Northern Buddhism, if you will, we have a notion of inherent enlightenment, which means that enlightenment or liberation, nirvana, mukti or moksha, is not something that you learn or something that you get. It's something that you already possess. It's something that you already have at some point of your being. And it's something that you realize is always there. That's a very important distinguishing doctrine within Mahayana Buddhism, inherent illumination. In many ways, the function of a teacher within a dharmic context is to help the student realize inherent liberation. Of course, when I talk about inherent liberation, I gradiate the experience of liberation. So I'm not talking about full liberation here, Nirodha Samapatti. I'm talking about degrees of liberation, degrees of illuminative experience. A good teacher is somebody who is able esoterically to touch that dimension of you who is always in contact, who is always in a state of samadhi or yoga, and bring that consciousness about, bring that consciousness through the fluctuations of the ego and the intellect, and help you manifest that part of you. That is done through crystal clear presence on the part of the teacher. That's how that is brought about. Again, here, this is necessary doctrine, not something that you should attempt to understand intellectually, but try to allow these doctrines, these thoughts to become seeds in your heart and in your mind that one day, over time, can grow to a heart understanding, an understanding that is not of the intellect, but of the soul or the heart, if you will. Moreover, certain tantric dynamics when it comes to yoga helps the teacher to transmit a certain power and grace to their students. The lineages, for example, of Buddhism, of course, have a horizontal component. You know, like physically, I am teaching other people. Physically, I go and see my teacher on the physical horizontal plane. But there is also some energetic esoteric components here, which can be viewed as, if you're connected to a yoga teacher, you're always connected to that person, not only when you're seeing them physically, but there is a certain energetic and spiritual support system there for you in place at all times, and that is known or called grace. Grace is always accessible if you're connected to a lineage, and one of the most important functions of a teacher is to be on the horizontal plane or the physical plane, that link that helps you establish contact with that grace and that power that is imbued within the lineage. So how is a lineage imbued with power and grace and the potency to bless sadhakas within that system? That is some advanced tantric teachings, but I can say, try to formulate this in a semi-coherent way, that we can create shapes on the physical plane. So I can make a drawing on the physical plane, and that drawing will at some point perish because of entropy. But we can create shapes and aggregates of energy on the energetic and the spiritual plane. And those aggregates, those energy shapes, if you will, are not influenced by the passing of time. They're accessible at all times because they exist on a vertical dimension, on the spiritual plane. And those energies or archetypal aggregates can be accessed at all times and accessed through connection to that specific lineage. An example here is the Yidam tradition. In Buddhism, Yidam is a type of deity that can be tapped into to bless your practice and to help you in meditation. They're gods, if you will, they're deities. And those deities exist on the physical plane in the form of drawings or statues, but they also have an existence on the astral or the energetic plane that you can tap into by being connected to a lineage and by working within a tradition. That only happens through lineage, through having a teacher. There is also the component of the root gurus. Root guru is the teacher of a lineage beyond time and space. So lineages often have root gurus or specific deities, gods, connected to them. That is the vertical blueprint of the power of that lineage, but not manifested on the physical plane. If this makes sense to you, you probably have read some esoteric literature or have some experience practicing an esoteric tradition from before. If this does not make sense, I'm awfully sorry. And feel free to ask questions below the video, as always, and I'll try to explain them. But those are some of the very vital esoteric components of a lineage and a student-teacher relationship, is that you're able to access certain energy forms and patterns of spiritual energy that is inherent within that lineage. Certain lineages are connected to certain energy patterns, energy forms, and certain deities, certain beings that exist on the spiritual plane that can be accessed and approached through that lineage. A good example, a personal example actually, is that I'm connected to the Gelupa lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, and within my specific lineage there are two deities that are, so to speak, patrons of that lineage, being Amitayu, who is the deity of clarity, and Tara, who is a female deity of active compassion. And those deities are said to, in a certain energetic way, and do not take this literally, but do not take it purely metaphorically either. Those deities are said to watch over and protect and bless everyone within that lineage. And this is a very important part of lineage as well. It's actually very vital to understand that these energy shapes are, no matter how you look at it, you can look at this as something that is powerful because it's shared by a lot of people, and by projecting belief onto something, you make it alive. And that kind of like making alive of something within you through lineage is what gives this power. But they still have an existence on the spiritual energetic plane as well, on the astral plane, if you will, which is understood over time. And also, one of the most important components to access that grace within a teacher, within a lineage, is by placing your trust in the teacher, which is why it's of paramount importance to question and analyze your teacher before going to them for teaching. Because placing your trust in somebody untrustworthy can cause trauma, but placing your trust in somebody you can relate to as a teacher, somebody who exemplifies parts of the teaching, is life-changing, because placing that trust means that you're going from the level of the intellect and down into the level of the heart or the soul, and that descent from mind and into heart, that allows for a certain openness within you on all planes, and that openness thus allows the descent of grace or power and blessings to you as a student. And that not only happens within tradition, but also placing your trust in somebody else on a material plane, placing your trust in your partner or your friend, also allows for a certain descent of grace. So I've already talked for 40 minutes, which is quite insane, a lot. But I'm going to end with answering some questions. So Anna, I think I answered your question at length. I hope I did so. And I got a question about the importance of connection between teacher and student, and I think I managed to brush upon that as well. It's important that the student finds the teacher someone they can relate to. If a teacher tries to place himself on a very elevated, aloof plane, someone who is above their students, that's very hard. So it's very important that a teacher manages to establish intimacy at a human level, at a purely horizontal level. We're both human beings. We have the same experiences. We live in the same temporal, horizontal universe. So very, very important that a teacher is capable of establishing that connection with their students on a horizontal plane. Very, very important. Of course, connection with a teacher is important. You need to feel connected, not only spiritually, but you need to feel connected on a psychological plane as well. A teacher needs to be somebody you relate to, and somebody who makes you feel safe, seen, and heard. Somebody who is available to you both as a teacher, but also just as a helper, as a guide in your practice. And the last question here is whether you need a physical teacher, somebody who is living in the same place as you. And I do not think so. I've had quite successful experiences working with students that I actually haven't met physically. It's been quite powerful, and I've noticed that that kind of energetic spiritual connection and the descent of grace and power into that relationship has taken place despite us not being able to meet physically. Of course, being able to meet physically with your teacher is a very good thing. But if you do not have any teachers living close to you that you feel that you can place your trust or establish a connection to, then it's of course totally okay as well to have a digital teacher, as long as that person is somebody you're actually talking to. Like a YouTube video or a text is not a teacher. Teacher-student relationship needs to be responsive, and it needs to be live. It needs to be something that is happening here and now. If you've managed to sit through this entire video, I congratulate you on your tapas and your patience, and I do hope that this video managed to shed some light on an often confusing topic. If you have any questions, feel free to either DM them to me on Instagram or leave them below this video. Thank you so much for watching, and may this video be of benefit to you, your practice, and those around you and the rest of the world. finishing off, I take refuge in my teacher and the lineage, the root guru, the yidam, the dharma, the sangha. And to all my students, I feel privileged and honored every day to be able to work with you and be a vehicle of dharma teaching and sadhana to all of you. You're all great people. Thank you for watching. May all beings be happy and free of suffering.